April 10th, 1945, the whisper crawled through the barracks like frost across glass. Oberofficerin Margarethe Reichert stood in the dim corridor of Stalag 7B, her hands trembling as she repeated the warning that would haunt her conscience forever. "Close your eyes and don't scream." The words were meant to protect, yet they carried the weight of unspeakable dread. Outside, the rumble of American tanks grew louder, a mechanical thunder that signaled not liberation but uncertainty for the German women who had worked as guards, administrators and medical staff in this prisoner-of-war camp near Memmingen, Bavaria. The collapse of the Third Reich had transformed these women from enforcers of Nazi authority into prisoners themselves. What had begun as patriotic service managing records, supervising kitchens, tending to wounded soldiers, now branded them as complicit in a regime whose atrocities were only beginning to surface in the world's consciousness. Reichert, 38 years old with graying blonde hair pulled severely back, had served the Wehrmacht for 3 years. She had witnessed horrors she tried desperately to forget: emaciated Allied prisoners, summary executions, the casual brutality that had become normalized. But she had never wielded a weapon, never struck a prisoner. Would that matter now? The barracks housed 47 German women that night, ranging from 19-year-old typist Greta Hoffmann to 56-year-old cook Anneliese Brandt. They huddled together in the wooden structure that still smelled of disinfectant and fear, their gray uniforms rumpled, their faces pale. The order to remain silent, to keep their eyes closed, came from their commanding officer, Hauptmann Klaus Weber, who had already fled the camp with most of the male guards. The women had been left behind with only their terror and that cryptic instruction. Historical accounts from the period, including those documented in the United States Army Center of Military History Records, reveal that the confusion and chaos of the final weeks of the European war created countless situations where the boundaries between victim, perpetrator, and bystander blurred beyond recognition. The advancing American forces had liberated concentration camps like Dachau just days earlier, discovering mountains of corpses and skeletal survivors whose testimony left soldiers enraged and traumatized. These same soldiers were now rolling into POW camps, their emotions raw, their capacity for mercy tested. Outside, the sound of boots on gravel echoed through the compound. American voices shouted commands in English that most of the women couldn't understand. Reichert pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, feeling the splinters through her thin uniform. She thought of her daughter, Elsa, 14 years old and safe in her grandmother's farmhouse near Stuttgart, she hoped. Communications had broken down weeks ago. She thought of the letters she would never write, the explanations she would never give. Greta Hoffmann began to cry softly, a whimpering sound that she tried to muffle with her sleeve. "Will they kill us?" She whispered to no one in particular. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The door to the barracks burst open and blinding flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Reichert squeezed her eyes shut, remembering the order, "Close your eyes and don't scream." Her heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps approached. The American soldiers who entered Stalag 7B that night were men transformed by what they had witnessed. Sergeant James Mitchell from Omaha, Nebraska, had vomited when he first walked through the gates of Dachau concentration camp on April 29th. The images were seared into his brain, the ovens still warm, the mass graves, the survivors who looked more like animated corpses than human beings. His unit, part of the 45th Infantry Division, had been redeployed to secure the surrounding POW camps and military installations. They expected resistance, defiance, perhaps even ambush. What they found instead were these women, frozen in place like statues, eyes clenched shut. Mitchell's flashlight beam swept across the barracks, illuminating faces etched with terror. His finger hovered near the trigger of his M1 Garand rifle, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Behind him, Private David Cohen from Brooklyn muttered in Yiddish a prayer or a curse. Mitchell couldn't tell. Cohen's entire family in Poland had been murdered in the Holocaust, a fact that had only recently been confirmed through Red Cross channels. The rage that burned in Cohen was palpable, and Mitchell worried about what his fellow soldier might do. "Hands where we can see them." Mitchell barked, though he suspected most of these women didn't speak English. Slowly, tentatively, hands emerged from beneath blankets and raised above heads. The women remained motionless otherwise, eyes still closed. The sight was eerily unsettling, as though they were performing some collective ritual of surrender that went beyond the physical. Lieutenant Robert Anderson pushed past Mitchell, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. At 32, Anderson was older than most of his men, a lawyer from Philadelphia who had been drafted in 1943. He had seen enough in the past months to understand that war transformed everyone it touched. "Open your eyes," he commanded in halting German, having learned basic phrases during the advance. "Augen auf." When no one moved, he repeated it louder. Margarethe Reichert was the first to comply. She opened her eyes and met Anderson's gaze directly, a gesture of courage or resignation, perhaps both. In that moment, Anderson saw neither a Nazi oppressor nor a victim, but simply a terrified human being awaiting judgment. The complexity of that recognition troubled him. Military intelligence had briefed them that women staff at POW camps had committed abuses, though the nature and extent varied dramatically. Some had been sadistic guards who rivaled their male counterparts in cruelty. Others had been clerical workers with no direct contact with prisoners. How was one supposed to distinguish between them in the chaos of conquest? According to documentation later compiled by the War Crimes Investigation Unit, as referenced in scholarly works on post-war justice, Allied forces struggled with the sheer scale of personnel to process. Millions of Germans would ultimately be screened through denazification programs, but in those first hours and days, decisions were made hastily, often arbitrarily. Anderson ordered the women to stand and file outside in single formation. They complied mechanically, moving like automatons programmed for obedience. As they emerged into the gray dawn of April 11th, Reichert noticed the American flag flying above the camp commandant's former office. The stars and stripes looked alien in this landscape of barbed wire and watchtowers. The liberators had become the new authority, and she and her companions had become the imprisoned. The women were herded into an open area and told to sit. Guards were posted around them, young American boys with hard eyes and tense fingers on their weapons. Greta Hoffman sat next to Reichert, still trembling. "What will they do to us?" She whispered again, her voice hoarse with fear. The interrogations began on April 12th in a requisitioned office that still bore the insignia of the Wehrmacht on its walls. Captain William Hartley, a counterintelligence officer from the Criminal Investigation Division, had arrived with a team of translators and stenographers. His task was monumental: determine who among these women had committed war crimes, who had been complicit, and who had been merely present. The distinctions mattered legally, but in the emotional aftermath of the concentration camp discoveries, the lines felt impossibly blurred. Margarethe Reichert was among the first called. She entered the office with her shoulders squared, determined to maintain whatever dignity remained to her. Hartley sat behind a metal desk, a folder open before him, his expression carefully neutral. A translator, a German Jewish emigrant named Ruth Goldstein, sat beside him. Goldstein's presence added another layer of complexity to the proceedings. She had escaped Germany in 1938, leaving behind family members who had perished. Her eyes held barely contained fury. "Name and position," Hartley began, and Reichert provided the information. She had been Oberofficer and Chief Overseer of the female staff. Her responsibilities included work assignments, discipline, and liaison with the male command structure. Hartley's questions came methodically. How many prisoners had been in the camp? What were the living conditions? Had she witnessed executions? Had she participated in the selection of prisoners for transport to other facilities? Reichert answered truthfully, understanding that lies would only damn her further. Yes, she had witnessed executions, deserters from the German army, primarily, shot in the early morning hours. Yes, the conditions had deteriorated severely in the final months as supply lines collapsed. No, she had not personally harmed any prisoner, but she had enforced regulations that kept them subjugated. The admission felt both honest and inadequate. Research from the International Military Tribunal archives reveals that determining individual culpability within the Nazi system proved extraordinarily challenging. Hannah Arendt would later coin the phrase, "the banality of evil," to describe how ordinary people participated in monstrous systems through bureaucratic compliance and moral compartmentalization. The women of Stalag 7B embodied this paradox. During a break in her interrogation, Reichert was returned to the holding area where the other women waited. They sat on the ground, guarded but not yet formally imprisoned. Anneliese Brandt, the elderly cook, had collapsed from exhaustion and stress. A young American medic, his Red Cross armband vivid against his uniform, tended to her with professional efficiency. The scene struck Reichert as surreal, the conquerors providing care to the conquered. "They found photographs," whispered Ingrid Schultz, a former records clerk, when Reichert sat down, "in the commandant's office. From the camps." The word camps carried new meaning now, distinct from the POW facilities. The concentration camps, the extermination centers, the industrialized murder, these were becoming known to the German people through their conquerors' eyes. Many, like Reichert, had heard rumors but convinced themselves they were Allied propaganda. The evidence was now undeniable. That evening, the women were moved to a larger detention facility near Munich, transported in the back of military trucks. The journey took 3 hours through a landscape of devastation. German cities lay in ruins, bombed into skeletal remnants of their former selves. Refugees clogged the roads, pushing carts laden with possessions, faces blank with trauma. The Wehrmacht had disintegrated, its soldiers discarding uniforms and melting into the civilian population. The thousand-year Reich had lasted 12 years and left Europe in ashes. At the detention facility, the women were photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned identification numbers. They were no longer individuals but subjects of investigation. Greta Hoffmann broke down completely during processing, sobbing that she had only typed letters. She had never hurt anyone, she just wanted to go home. The American WAC officer processing her showed no sympathy. "Everyone just followed orders," she said bitterly in accented German. "That's what they all say." The Munich detention facility housed thousands by late April 1945. The Americans had transformed a former Wehrmacht barracks into a sorting center for Nazi personnel, from high-ranking officials to low-level functionaries. The women from Stalag 7B occupied a section alongside female guards from other camps, nurses who had served in SS hospitals, and administrators from various government ministries. The atmosphere was thick with fear, resentment, and a dawning realization of collective guilt. Margarethe Reichert found herself sharing a cell with 5 other women, including a former concentration camp guard named Hild Weber. Weber was 24, blonde, and stone-faced. She had served at Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp north of Berlin, and unlike Reichert, she showed no remorse. "I did my duty," Weber insisted during their first night together. "If Germany had won, we would be heroes. Instead, we are criminals. This is the justice of the victors." Her words hung in the air, challenging and disturbing. The distinction between POW camps and concentration camps was crucial, yet the American authorities struggled to convey this to the German population. POW camps, like Stalag 7B, held captured enemy soldiers and were governed by the Geneva Conventions. Conditions varied from adequate to harsh, but systematic extermination was not the objective. Concentration camps, in contrast, were instruments of genocide, places where human beings were worked to death, starved, gassed, and cremated on an industrial scale. The women who had served in these different systems faced vastly different moral and legal reckonings. In early May, following Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, the interrogations intensified. Allied authorities established automatic arrest categories for denazification. Anyone who had held certain ranks or positions was detained pending investigation. This included all concentration camp personnel, Gestapo officers, SS members above a certain rank, and government officials. The net was cast wide, capturing both architects of atrocity and peripheral participants. Documentation from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum archives, which preserves extensive records from the post-war period, shows that female perpetrators often received lighter sentences than their male counterparts, reflecting the gender biases of the era. Prosecutors and judges struggled to reconcile the image of women as inherently nurturing and peaceful with evidence of their participation in cruelty. For Reichert, the days blurred into a monotonous routine of confinement. Food was scarce, ironic given Germany's wartime hunger policies toward subject populations. The women received thin soup and hard bread once daily. They slept on wooden bunks without mattresses. 60 women crowded into a space meant for 30. Disease spread quickly: dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis. The Americans provided minimal medical care, their resources stretched thin and their sympathy limited. On May 15th, Reichert was informed that she would be transferred to a witness camp rather than face war crimes charges. The investigators had concluded that her role as Stalag 7B, while complicit in the Nazi system, did not constitute prosecutable offenses. She had not directly harmed prisoners, and several former POWs had testified that she had occasionally shown small mercies and extra ration delivered discreetly, a blind eye turned to minor infractions. These tiny acts of humanity, previously meaningless in the face of systemic oppression, now potentially saved her life. Greta Hoffmann, the young typist, received similar determination. Her youth and her position in records administration worked in her favor. But Hild Weber faced different prospects. Witnesses from Ravensbrück had identified her as participating in selections for the gas chambers and beating prisoners. She would be tried before a military tribunal. The night before her transfer, Reichert lay awake listening to Weber's steady breathing across the cell. How did one become someone like Weber? What choices, what rationalizations, what circumstances transformed an ordinary young woman into an instrument of murder? Reichert knew the answer was more complicated than simple evil. It involved propaganda, peer pressure, desensitization, ideological indoctrination, and the human capacity to compartmentalize. It involved the gradual erosion of moral boundaries until the unthinkable became routine. The witness camp near Dachau was a liminal space, not quite freedom, not quite imprisonment. Margarethe Reichert arrived there on May 22nd, part of a group of 300 Germans deemed useful to Allied investigations but not criminal themselves. The camp had previously held displaced persons liberated from Nazi camps, a bitter irony not lost on anyone. Now it housed Germans who would testify about the regime's operations, providing evidence for the tribunals that were being planned. Reichert's new role was uncomfortable. She was required to give detailed testimony about the command structure at Stalag 7B, the treatment of prisoners, the instructions received from higher authorities. Her statements would be used to prosecute camp commandants and senior officers. In a sense, she was cooperating with the enemy, except the enemy was no longer the enemy and her former comrades were no longer comrades. The moral geography had been completely redrawn. The witness camp allowed more freedom of movement within its boundaries. Reichert could walk in the yard, access a small library of books in German, and receive letters when mail service was restored. She wrote to her mother's farmhouse, desperate for news of her daughter Elsa. Weeks passed with no reply. The postal system across defeated Germany was chaotic, and millions of families were separated, displaced, or destroyed. In June, Reichert was assigned to work in the camp's administrative office, her organizational skills deemed useful. The Americans were processing enormous volumes of documentation: Nazi Party records, military files, concentration camp ledgers. The paper trail of genocide was being systematically cataloged. Working alongside her was a former concentration camp survivor named Judith Rosenberg, a Polish Jewish woman in her 30s who had survived Auschwitz. The arrangement was deliberately provocative, forcing perpetrator and victim to coexist in mundane bureaucratic cooperation. Their first days together were silent, tense. Rosenberg's forearm bore the tattooed number from Auschwitz. Reichert couldn't help but stare at it, that permanent mark of dehumanization. Finally, Rosenberg spoke. "You want to know what it was like?" It wasn't a question. Reichert nodded, throat tight. What followed was hours of testimony delivered in flat, affectless tones. The cattle cars, the selections, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the crematoria, the medical experiments, the arbitrary murders, the starvation, the disease. Rosenberg spoke as if reciting a shopping list, her emotions locked behind walls of trauma. Academic studies on perpetrator-survivor encounters, such as those compiled in legal psychology research, suggest that these interactions rarely produce the reconciliation or understanding that observers might hope for. Instead, they often deepen trauma for survivors while forcing perpetrators to confront the human cost of their complicity in ways that abstract testimony cannot. "I didn't know," Reichert whispered when Rosenberg finished. The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Rosenberg's laugh was bitter. "Everyone says that. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. The camps were not secrets. They were everywhere. The smoke could be smelled for kilometers. The trains ran through cities. The prisoners were marched through towns. Germany didn't know because Germany chose ignorance. The accusation stung because it was accurate." Reichert had heard whispers, had seen things that didn't align with official propaganda, had experienced moments of cognitive dissonance that she had quickly suppressed. She had chosen her daughter's safety, her own comfort, her ideological loyalty over moral courage. She had made those choices day after day until they became habit. On June 6th, Reichert finally received a letter from her mother. Elsa was alive, but the farmhouse had been bombed in March. Her mother and daughter were living with relatives in a half-destroyed village near Heidelberg. They were hungry but surviving. Reading her daughter's postscript, "When are you coming home, Mama?" Reichert wept for the first time since her capture. Home no longer existed as a place, only as a memory of innocence that could never be recovered. The major war crimes trials were being organized in Nuremberg. The Allies had decided to prosecute the Nazi leadership publicly, establishing legal precedents for crimes against humanity and genocide. Lesser trials were planned for concentration camp personnel, military officers who had committed atrocities, and civilian officials who had implemented genocidal policies. Thousands would face judgment in the coming years. By August 1945, the witness camp population had swelled to nearly 2,000. Germany was a nation in ruins physically, politically, and morally. 12 million German refugees were fleeing the eastern territories as borders were redrawn. Food shortages verged on famine. The currency was worthless. The occupation authorities struggled to maintain order while implementing denazification, a process meant to purge Nazi ideology and punish complicity. Margarete Reichert continued her work processing documents, now assigned specifically to files related to female guards and administrative personnel. She read testimony from survivors of Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, and Stutthof about women who had beaten prisoners, set dogs on them, withheld food, and participated in selections for execution. Some of these women were younger than her daughter Elsa. The photographs showed faces that could belong to schoolteachers, nurses, shopkeepers, ordinary women who had done extraordinary evil. Hild Weber's trial began on August 20th at a military court in Dachau. Reichert was compelled to attend as an observer, part of her ongoing cooperation with Allied authorities. The courtroom was austere, military efficiency without decoration. Weber sat between two MPs, her expression blank. Witnesses testified. Survivors who identified her as the guard who had beaten them during roll call, who had dragged sick women from barracks to die in the cold, who had laughed while prisoners were punished. Weber's defense attorney, a German lawyer working under Allied supervision, argued that she had followed orders, that refusal would have meant her own imprisonment or death, that the regime had indoctrinated her from adolescence. The prosecution countered that many guards had served without excessive cruelty, that choices existed even within totalitarian systems, that Weber had exceeded requirements through sadistic enthusiasm. Legal scholars studying post-war tribunals, as documented in academic journals on transitional justice, note that following orders was explicitly rejected as a defense at Nuremberg and subsequent trials. The principle of individual moral responsibility, regardless of hierarchical command, became a cornerstone of international humanitarian law. The verdict came on August 27th. Guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Sentence: death by hanging. Weber showed no reaction as the judgment was read. She was 24 years old and would be dead before her 25th birthday. Reichert left the courtroom shaking, understanding that her own fate could easily have been identical if circumstances had been slightly different, if she had been assigned to a concentration camp instead of a POW facility, if she had been more zealous, if witnesses had testified differently. In September, the witness camp received new instructions. All personnel would undergo formal denazification hearings. The Allies had established categories: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated. Each German adult would be evaluated and classified, with consequences ranging from execution to loss of employment to simple fines. The system was meant to achieve justice while allowing Germany to rebuild, but its implementation was chaotic and often arbitrary. Reichert's hearing took place on September 12th. A panel of 3 officers, American, British, and French, reviewed her file. Her membership in the Nazi Women's League was noted, her position at Stalag 7B discussed, her testimony on behalf of prosecutors considered. Character witnesses included former POWs who had been held at the camp. One, a British sergeant named Thomas Crawford, stated that Reichert had once slipped him extra medicine when he was ill, an act that had probably saved his life. After 2 hours of questioning, the panel classified her as a follower complicit but not criminal. Her punishment was suspension from public employment and a fine of 500 Reichsmarks. Though, with the currency worthless, the monetary penalty was symbolic. She was free to leave the witness camp and attempt to rebuild her life. The relief was overwhelming and crushing simultaneously. She was free, but free to return to what? A devastated country, a ruined reputation, a daughter who would grow up knowing her mother had served the Nazi regime. Reichert was released on September 25th. She was given travel papers and ration cards and sent on her way. The journey from Dachau to Heidelberg took 5 days, hitching rides on military trucks, walking long stretches, sleeping in bombed-out buildings alongside thousands of other displaced Germans. The landscape was apocalyptic: cities reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed, fields pocked with craters. October brought cold rains to southern Germany, turning the ruins into a muddy morass. Margarethe Reichert reached her mother's village on October 3rd, walking the final 15 kilometers because no transport was available. The village had suffered direct hits during Allied bombing raids. Half the buildings were destroyed or heavily damaged. She found her mother and daughter living in 2 rooms of what had once been a 4-room house. Elsa, now 15, was a stranger. She had been 11 when Reichert had left to work for the Wehrmacht, believing the propaganda about serving the fatherland. 4 years of war had transformed her daughter from a child into a young woman with suspicious eyes and a hardened demeanor. Their reunion was awkward, tentative. Elsa had heard things about her mother's service, whispered accusations from neighbors whose own complicity made them eager to deflect blame onto others. "Did you hurt people, Mama?" Elsa asked on the 3rd night, her voice small in the darkness. Reichert considered lying, considered explaining, considered silence. Finally she said, "I was part of something terrible. I didn't pull the triggers or turn on the gas, but I was part of the machine. I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand how I let that happen." It was the most honest thing she had said since her capture. The village was a microcosm of post-war German society. Everyone had participated in Nazi system to some degree. Everyone claimed ignorance or coercion. Everyone wanted to forget and move forward. The denazification process was already breaking down under the practical impossibility of punishing millions. Former Nazi Party members were quietly returning to positions of authority because the Allies needed German administrators to run the occupied zones. Reichert found work cleaning houses for American occupation personnel. Bitter irony that she scrubbed the floors of the conquerors who had liberated Germany from the regime she had served. The work was menial and paid little, but it provided survival rations. Her mother tended a small garden, growing potatoes and cabbage. Elsa attended a school operated by Allied authorities, where the curriculum had been purged of Nazi ideology and replaced with democratic principles. Research on post-war Germany, documented extensively in historical archives and academic studies, reveals that the process of confronting Nazi crimes was gradual and incomplete. Many Germans embraced a narrative of collective victimhood. Everyone had suffered under Hitler. Everyone had been deceived. The Holocaust was something done by a small criminal elite rather than a system enabled by millions of participants. In November, Reichert encountered Greta Hoffmann at the village market. The young typist from Stalag 7B had also been released and returned to her family home nearby. They stood in awkward silence, neither wanting to acknowledge their shared past. Finally, Hoffmann spoke. I tell people I worked in an office. I don't mention where, Reichert nodded, understanding. They would never speak again, each carrying their burden of complicity and isolation. Winter arrived with brutal cold and food shortages that approached starvation. The German rationing system provided 1,200 calories per day, well below subsistence levels. Black markets flourished, with people trading heirlooms for bread, jewelry for potatoes. The American military government tried to maintain order, but the scale of devastation overwhelmed their resources. People died of cold, hunger, and disease by the thousands. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Reichert attended church service with her mother and daughter. The village priest, who had served throughout the Nazi period without resistance, preached about forgiveness and redemption. Reichert sat in the pew, listening to words about mercy and grace, and felt only numbness. Could there be redemption for what Germany had done? Could there be forgiveness when most of the victims were dead? Could she forgive herself when doing so felt like an obscene erasure of the suffering her complicity had enabled? After the service, Elsa took her mother's hand as they walked through the snow. It was a small gesture, a tentative offer of connection. Reichert squeezed back, tears freezing on her cheeks. Redemption, if it existed, would be a lifetime's work. It would require bearing witness, teaching her daughter and future generations about the dangers of ideology, nationalism, and the human capacity for evil. It would require rejecting easy absolution and comfortable forgetfulness. The year 1946 brought the Nuremberg trials into full operation. 24 major Nazi leaders faced an international military tribunal charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit these crimes. The trials were broadcast internationally, providing the first comprehensive public accounting of Nazi atrocities. For Germans, including Margarethe Reichert, watching the proceedings was a process of painful revelation. Reichert had no radio, but the American Cultural Center in Heidelberg screened newsreels of the trial proceedings. She attended twice, sitting in the back of the room, watching grainy footage of Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and others sitting in the dock. Most shocking were the documentary films shown as evidence footage shot by Allied forces when they liberated the concentration camps. The skeletal prisoners, the mountains of corpses, the gas chambers and crematoria, the piles of belongings taken from victims. The German audience sat in stunned silence. Some wept, others walked out, unable to confront the images. "They are exaggerating," an elderly man near Reichert muttered. "Propaganda to justify what they did to us." But the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Testimony from survivors, documents bearing signatures of Nazi officials, photographs, films of genocide had been meticulously documented by its perpetrators, and now that documentation was being used to condemn them. The Nuremberg principles established crucial legal precedents, that individuals are responsible for their actions even under orders, that aggressive war is a crime, that genocide and crimes against humanity are punishable under international law. These concepts, revolutionary at the time, emerged from the specific horrors of Nazi Germany but would shape international law for decades. In February, Reichert received a summons to testify at a trial in Dachau. The defendant was Hauptmann Klaus Weber, the commanding officer who had abandoned the female staff at Stalag 7B before the American arrival. Weber was charged with mistreatment of prisoners and violation of the Geneva Conventions. Reichert's testimony would be crucial, as she had witnessed his direct orders and actions. She traveled to Dachau by train, a journey that took most of a day through the still, devastated landscape. The courtroom was in the same building where Hild Weber had been tried and convicted. Klaus Weber looked diminished, a defeated man in a borrowed suit, his arrogance stripped away. He met Reichert's eyes briefly, and she saw fear there, recognition that his former subordinate now held power over his fate. Reichert testified factually, describing Weber's orders, the conditions he enforced, the occasional instances of brutality she had witnessed. She did not exaggerate, but neither did she minimize. The prosecutor asked if Weber had ever showed mercy or deviation from harsh treatment. Reichert paused, remembering Christmas 1943 when Weber had authorized slightly increased rations for prisoners. She testified to that as well, determined to be honest rather than vengeful. The defense attorney seized on this, suggesting Weber had been as humane as circumstances allowed. But cross-examination revealed the broader context, the systematic underfeeding, the inadequate medical care, the punishments that exceeded military necessity. Weber was convicted and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, less severe than many sentences but still a substantial reckoning. Returning to the village, Reichert found that spring had arrived, bringing the first signs of renewal. Fields were being planted, buildings slowly repaired, life reasserting itself amid the ruins. The Marshall Plan was being discussed, American aid to rebuild Europe as a bulwark against Soviet communism. Germany would be divided into East and West, a physical manifestation of the emerging Cold War. The focus was shifting from punishment to reconstruction. Elsa had turned 16 and was showing aptitude in school, particularly in languages. She spoke of wanting to study English, perhaps even travel to America someday. Reichert encouraged this, understanding that her daughter's future lay in transcending the past, not being imprisoned by it. Yet she also insisted Elsa understand what had happened, why it had happened, how ordinary people had participated in extraordinary evil. By 1947, the immediate post-war crisis was easing, replaced by the grinding challenge of rebuilding. Margarethe Reichert, now 40 years old, had found steady employment as a translator for the American occupation government. Her English, learned in school decades earlier, proved useful in bridging between authorities and German civilians. The work brought better rations and modest pay, enough to move with her mother and daughter into a small, intact house. The major Nuremberg trial had concluded in October 1946 with 12 death sentences and 7 prison terms. Hermann Göring cheated the gallows by suicide the night before his execution. The remaining condemned men were hanged on October 16th, their bodies cremated, ashes scattered in a secret location to prevent Nazi martyrdom sites. Subsequent trials were prosecuting doctors who conducted medical experiments, judges who enforced Nazi racial laws, industrialists who used slave labor, and military officers who committed atrocities. Reichert followed these proceedings with morbid fascination, seeing in the defendants' justifications echoes of her own rationalizations. They had followed orders. They had not known the full scope of crimes. They had been cogs in a machine too large to resist. These explanations were simultaneously true and insufficient. The trials were teaching her, and Germany, that complicity carried moral weight even when it fell short of direct perpetration. Denazification was largely abandoned by 1948 as Cold War priorities superseded justice concerns. The Western Allies needed German cooperation against Soviet expansion, which meant reintegrating former Nazis into positions of responsibility. The irony was bitter. Many who had committed worse offenses than those imprisoned were quietly rehabilitated, particularly if they possessed technical expertise or anti-communist credentials. In June 1948, currency reform established the Deutschmark in the Western zones, stabilizing the economy and beginning the economic miracle that would transform West Germany into an industrial powerhouse. Reichert was able to save money, plan for Elsa's future education, contemplate a life beyond mere survival. Yet prosperity felt obscene when built on the ashes of genocide, when so many victims had no future at all. Elsa graduated from gymnasium in 1950 and was accepted to university in Heidelberg to study English literature. She was among the first generation to grow up in the shadow of Nazi crimes while being personally uninvolved. How would they process this inheritance? Reichert saw her daughter's generation oscillating between determination to never forget and desperate desire to escape the past's weight. In 1953, Germany regained partial sovereignty as the Federal Republic, though occupation formally continued. Reichert attended a memorial ceremony in Heidelberg for Holocaust victims, one of the first public acknowledgments of Jewish suffering. She stood among other Germans, many of whom had been complicit in various ways, listening to survivors speak. A rabbi spoke about the imperative to remember, to teach future generations, to ensure never again was not empty rhetoric but genuine commitment. Reichert began volunteering to speak at schools about her experiences, initially reluctant but feeling an obligation to bear witness from the perspective of a perpetrator's assistant. She did not claim heroism or resistance. She described how ideology, nationalism, fear, and conformity had led her to serve a genocidal regime. She emphasized how ordinary people become complicit through small compromises, rationalized choices, and willful ignorance. The students listened with uncomfortable attention, seeing in her story a warning about their own capacity for moral failure. By 1960, Reichert was 53 years old. Elsa had married, was teaching English at a gymnasium, had given Reichert 2 grandchildren. West Germany was prosperous, democratic, integrated into NATO and the European community. The economic miracle had brought material comfort, but the moral reckoning remained incomplete. Many former Nazis held positions in government, business, and academia. The full history of the Holocaust was only beginning to be taught in schools. A younger generation was starting to ask harder questions about their parents' and grandparents' roles. The warning, "Close your eyes and don't scream," had been meant to protect, to minimize confrontation between defeated Germans and victorious Americans in those chaotic final days. But Reichert had learned that closing one's eyes and remaining silent was precisely how atrocity became possible. The work of remembrance, of testimony, of moral education was the work of a lifetime and beyond. She would continue telling her story, bearing witness to complicity, ensuring that future generations understood how easily ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil when they choose comfort over courage, obedience over conscience, silence over witness. The American soldiers who had liberated Stalag 7B had represented both judgment and mercy, arriving with justified rage but ultimately choosing a legal process over vengeance. That choice, to hold individuals accountable through law rather than collective punishment, had given Germany a path to redemption, imperfect, incomplete, but possible. Reichert had walked that path, never reaching absolution, but finding purpose in memory and warning. Her story, and the stories of millions like her, remained necessary testimonies to the fragility of civilization and the constant vigilance required to preserve human dignity.